Without art, we would not have a shared history or a language. Art has allowed us to evolve and adapt. Like the outlines you see here, Stone Age man drew simple line drawings. You've all seen child's drawings as well. How is it that these simple lines are interpreted as objects? Why is it we recognize two dots and a semicircle as a smiley face universally? Why? Those simple lines are processed by the same brain areas that interpret the edge of an object. But there are no pencil lines in the real world. How are we different than the other animals? Here's an example of what a human sees on the left and the bird sees on the right, this colorful picture. So humans were meant to be awake during the day and asleep during the night. The human eye has special cells called cone cells that help us interpret daytime vision and daytime stimuli. And they come in 3 types. Birds have 4 plus some in the UV spectrum. So what does a bird brain see? This is what we think it sees, but actually we can no more understand what a bird sees as we cannot perceive what a bat sees in echolocation. So back to the humans. So 3 types of cells, cone cells, short wavelength cells that see blue, medium wavelength cells that see green, and long wavelength cells that see red and yellow. Which color is the most striking color of the spectrum? Which color alerts us? Would any of you say red? Anyone say red? Raise your hands if you think it's red. Red, everyone, raise it high. Yes, red. Yes, red's the color of blood. Red's the color of the stop sign. Red's the color of the Corvette. But we're all wrong. It's yellow. Yellow is at the peak. And the answer comes from the physics of light and optics. It is the most intense color. Can you imagine sitting in a bright yellow room? Your eyes would become exhausted. Have you ever wondered why yellow is the color in between green and red on the traffic light? It's actually the yellow that's important. It's telling us to do something, to take action. We're kind of like, okay, you should know you should stop at red, you should passively go with green. But yellow tells us, hopefully, to slow down, many times to speed up. And we also can use that double yellow line. Have you ever been in a really terrible rainstorm, snowstorm, and you can see that double yellow line? It is the only cue that's left. So yellow is at the peak. So how does the brain work? What are the different parts that are part of the visual system? Information comes in through the eye and heads straight to the back of the brain. That area in the very back is called the occipital lobe. It kind of takes in information. And then it goes to the where and the what parts of the brain. The where is the parietal lobe. It's that yellow area, and the what is the green area. So what do these where and what places do? Well, the parietal lobe is important for visual spatial processing. It's important in detecting space-time movement. The temporal lobe is important for our long-term memory and our short-term memory, and it helps identify objects. So these work together with the occipital lobe to form a snap judgment. Sometimes we fail to use the front part, the frontal lobe. That's the higher processing, thinking part of our brain that really, truly analyzes things and interprets them. Putting it all together, brain, eye, images. So starting with the image on the left is a picture of a tree. The information, the light from that tree is sent through the eye, through the pupil, and it's refracted by the cornea lens, is then focused towards the retina and then sent through the optic nerve. Note that it's upside down, it's flipped, but focused. Information is sent to the brain, where the brain actually flips it again and then decides what it's looking at. And decides that, no, it's not just a green and brown thing, that it's a tree. If you've had a chance to look, and hopefully you will tonight, upstairs in the Currents Gallery, there's an amazing piece of work by DeVoris Berber. And what is this? It's a piece of work with an orb in front of it. It's actually spools of thread on wire. The orb is like the eyeball. It inverts the image and it focuses it. Believe it or not, every single human being will recognize this image as a woman. But we have overlearned images imprinted in our brain, and thus we decode it. Once you have finally learned in school what the Mona Lisa is, you cannot unlearn it. You cannot unsee the Mona Lisa. So, are you really seeing? Is that the truth? Well, you know, a good, healthy brain isn't very good. Now I'm going to ask for a little participation. There are 4 different angles here of different colors. Can you see there's a red, green, blue, and yellow? How many of you think that the largest of the angles is the red? Raise your hand if you think the largest is the red. And the smallest, would you think it's the green? Which is the right angle? Yellow, or yellow or blue. So it's a toss-up between yellow or blue. Okay. Blue? We have a lot of KMA board members who say blue. We'll go with blue. Wow. You're all wrong. Again, why is that? They're all exactly right angles. They're exactly the same. So why were you so deceived? It's because we live in a world where we perceive shadowing as distance, convergence as distance. So we have decided, even as I look at it, I was like, that red one looks so big. But it's our eyes that deceive us. We can't help but take into account that there must be a horizon in the distance. So we impose our 3D world into a 2D picture. And we do this in everyday life. We've seen innumerable railroad tracks that recede into the horizon. So when we see 2 lines that go from bottom to top in a photograph, we know it's distance. We know that there's a recession. And you saw with the other picture of the angles, you said, well, that's cheating. You had shadowing, they were different shapes. This is cheating, you have the scenery, oh my. Let's break it down to something so basic. How about just 2 lines that are barely receding to the top of the page? No other distractors. You might almost convince yourself that the top line, the top railroad tie, is a bit bigger than the bottom. They're exactly the same size. Yet, we have to convince ourselves of this, even without those distractors, the shadowing, the colors. So even the really good brain with no distraction is pretty bad. As you walked into the building, and before you went down the stairs, there was a work on your left by Ulf Puder. You probably said, okay, it's a bridge scene, a little town, sort of neutral colors. You passed by it, you made a snap judgment, an assumption of what you saw, and you moved on. That's just occipital, parietal, temporal. You didn't stop to use the frontal lobe. And actually, if you look a little closer, something is terribly wrong. There are lines that don't connect. There are parts of the canvas that are washed away. The perspective is off if you look at it closely. There's something terribly wrong, but it's not until our frontal lobe tells us so. But in most of our lives, we pass by things and decide that our snap judgment was the real judgment. Something to pause and think about. So how do we know what we see? We have to learn what we see. It takes a lifetime of visual experience. Can you imagine someone, even when we were growing up, I couldn't imagine what an iPhone was. You have to have learned it. We have this effect called pareidolia, where humans desire patterns. We want patterns. And we look for them everywhere, particularly face patterns. We recognize them even though we'd rather not. We see the man in the moon just like we see the smiley face, even though we know it's just craters and shadowing. Buford Delaney really capitalizes on this process, one of the great Harlem Renaissance artists that we have housed here, his great works. This is a portrait of Ella Fitzgerald. And if you look at the canvas in person upstairs, you'll see heavy gobs of paint obscuring the face, and yet every single human will recognize the face. So even though up close it's just globs of different colors of paint, we can still interpret it as we stand back. He's also capitalizing on another perspective, the overuse of yellow. His painting is a very rich, heavy, hard to look at yellow, there's an intensity about it. It almost says something about the artist, that he could stand for perhaps hundreds of hours before a bright yellow canvas and experience that intensity and perhaps eye fatigue as well. And lastly, one of our Impressionist artists, American Impressionist, Catherine Wiley, has this beautiful image of a mother and a child. Again, this is universally recognized. And what is it that we like so much about Impressionistic art? We have two types of vision. We have the very focused central vision, the kind that's so important for reading and close hand types of work. And then there is the peripheral, the perspective kind of vision. But you stand back and you can suddenly appreciate the whole. In addition, she also uses soft and beautiful colors that are, again, not so hard on the human eye. So I'd like to end. You might wonder who in fact is the neuroscientist? Is it in fact the artist that is studying us? And with that, I'd like to bridge over to our wonderful curator, Stephen Wicks, who's going to talk about the other side of things. And he is our wonderful Barbara and Bernard Bernstein curator. Stephen?
Thanks, Monica. Thanks also to Patrick Wade for inviting me to be part of this presentation. I got to tell you, when they first asked me to be part of this, I was sitting here thinking, I'm going to be talking about neuroscience. I think I can maybe make something up that complements it, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I've got several different reasons why I should be part of this presentation, personal reasons. My mother was severely afflicted with brain disease later in her life. My son, partially inspired by that, has chosen to pursue graduate studies in neuroscience at Fisk University. And part of the reason why he was able to get into Fisk was because he had a wonderful internship with Monica and with Dr. Dougherty. So that part of neuroscience is close to home. And then when I started thinking about the artwork that I could talk about tonight, unfortunately, Knoxville, despite its distinguished art history, two of its greatest artists ended their lives in institutions for some sort of brain disease. And so I thought, well, maybe there's something here that I can get at in looking at their work and seeing if in some ways changes in their work throughout their career maybe shed light on what's happening inside. So with that, I want to show you some images that I've gathered, some of which Monica has introduced to you, and I'm going to go into a little more depth on dissecting some of these images. So first we're going to look at the work of Catherine Wiley. Catherine Wiley was a remarkable artist. She was a leader in Knoxville's arts community. As a young woman, she took off and went up to study by herself in New York City with leading artists, came back to Knoxville and organized exhibitions, galvanized the art community. So she's someone that really had it together, had a lot of energy and focus. And here's a photograph of her on the left, a self-portrait on the right. This is a painting that is upstairs in our Higher Ground Gallery, which is devoted to the history of art connected to East Tennessee. And it's, I think, one of her finest works. It's from the peak of her career. She lived until 1958, but as of 1926, she's institutionalized for an undisclosed illness. During the 19-teens, this is when she's hitting full stride for these beautiful sunlit paintings done out of doors, and it's all about this, again, beauty of rich, dazzling color in the landscape. She's also very interested in connections between particularly women and children. So it's that connection that she wants to bring to the fore as well. Here's a close-up showing the woman and the child. You can see again these idyllic expressions. Everything seems to be just going their way in this great landscape setting. And then here are two works that are also on view upstairs that are from the 1920s. The one on the left is done roughly a year or so before she's institutionalized. And you may not be able to see it in these slides. I encourage you to go upstairs and look at the actual works of art. But there is a profound change in what she was doing in the 19-teens and in these two paintings. There's a profound change in terms of the thickness of the paint and the urgency with which it's laid down on canvas. It's almost as if she's squeezing the paint right out of the tube onto the canvas. The other thing, you'll notice that both of these are indoor scenes. They appear to be closed in. The figures appear to be detached from one another, isolated psychologically. The expression on the woman's face in the far left appears to be burdened with some kind of inner weight. Even the child appears to look off. They just seem psychologically really in despair. And then on the right, the woman's back is to us. Again, she's isolating herself from the viewer. Here's a better shot. It shows you the close-up of the work on the left from her mature period, and this later work, you can see the difference up close. And so again, just comparing the mid-career work, the bright colors, the faces lit by sunlight, uniform brushwork, and then later this turbulent brushwork, vacant expressions, darker colors, and everything is indoors and closed in. What could have sparked these changes? There are some theories. I've talked to scholars that know Catherine's work and know her family history, and basically some people point to the fact that her father died in 1919, that began to set things off for her, but then her dear friend and fellow artist, whose work is also up in Higher Ground, Lloyd Branson, dies in 1925. And then she had been trying to gain acceptance by the National Academy of Design. That was a major marking point for artists that wanted to establish their professional credentials. And she received several rejections, one of which came in 1925, around the time that she appears to have gone into decline. So again, those are just different ideas about what might have triggered this change in her brain health. Buford Delaney is one of the greatest American painters of the 20th century, and was born, grew up here in Knoxville, just about a mile or so straight east of us. And Buford produced some remarkable work during his long and productive career. This is the beginning of his career where he's doing these portraits of family members. This is a portrait of his mother, done in pastel. It's upstairs in our gallery, done in 1933 when he was 22. I'm sorry, 32. Yeah, get my math together. And then on the right is a photograph of his mother in 1910, and you can see how he's describing her in ways that show his academic skill as an artist. Also, his color choice is descriptive, the marks are descriptive. She appears to be a figure in space, there's shadow. It's looking at the external reality of things. This is to change profoundly as his career continues. Here we see a work from his late mature period in the mid-1960s of his niece Imogene. This painting's not upstairs, but I wanted to show it to you because I think it's fascinating. He begins to complain of hearing voices. Friends have noted changes in his behavior, and that he goes through cycles where he's focused and lucid and productive, and then other times where they have to basically find him and drag him back into a studio because he's been out wandering and doesn't know where he is. Anyway, as he develops whatever sort of brain disease was being affecting him, he turns to art as a way of pulling himself out of this inner darkness that he described. And his antidote for that inner darkness was painting in these brilliant hues. And what happens is, portraits of figures in space gradually dissolve into these studies of light. If you look at the arm of his niece Imogene, it's hovering out in this yellow atmosphere. The reason for that is that originally he painted her in an armchair, and then during the course of developing the composition felt as if, well, you know, that stuff just doesn't matter. What matters is light and color. And so that's what he ended up doing, was just painting the physical remnants out. She's in this complete sea of yellow light. And then, as Monica showed you, here's a portrait of Ella Fitzgerald from a few years later, 1968. This is how Ella looked. Over here, she's been almost completely dissolved in this sea of light. This was the healing light that he was after. Even the light appears to well up inside of her, and you can see signs of it inside her eyes. And so he's pulling that healing energy from the people around him. He senses what's going on beneath the surface of the visible world. And then eventually delves into abstraction, complete abstraction. It's as if he's looking at the work of Monet, such as the haystacks on the left. And if you compare this detail from one of Monet's haystacks with the painting that's upstairs called Scattered Light, they're very much in common in terms of the search for pure color and light in nature. So again, comparing early portraits of Buford's work from the 1930s or so to the 1960s, huge difference. And again, to what extent do these changes reflect changing brain health? I wanted to also touch on work by artists who are in our collection. They're up on the third floor, that they are producing work in ways that challenges us as viewers, psychologically or in terms of perception. As Monica mentioned, Deborah Sperber, she works in a really unusual way. I mean, you don't see many artists that stack spools of thread on these ball chains and suspend them in these strange upside-down configurations. And here's a close-up of some of those spools of thread. Here's a close-up of the crystal gazing sphere. She was a traditional painter, and she was in an opening for one of her exhibitions, and she was looking around and seeing people looking at her artwork. And she was sitting there thinking, I wonder what's happening in their brains and what they're actually perceiving. And is it what I want them to perceive? And so that led her to abandon traditional painting and get into using this kind of approach. Here is that gazing sphere, this little crystal ball on the top of a rod, and it's what allows this abstract thing on the wall to appear to our brains to be the Mona Lisa. And Monica's always showed you a chart like this, but that's how you get from there on the left to there on the right. And you'll have to see it for yourself tonight when you go upstairs. And then finally, a painting by Ulf Puder, which you all passed as you walked in here if you came in through our front door. And it's a painting called Baustab, which in German means to put a frieze on building. And he's from East Germany, and he lived during the Cold War period. And he's focused his paintings on architectural landscapes that deal with East Germany, particularly Leipzig, the city that he's from. And they have this precise architectural edge to them, but the closer you look, the more you begin to notice things aren't really the way they should be. There's something going on. On the left is one of his paintings. On the right is a photograph of suburban Leipzig, which again is the subject matter that he tends to look to. But if we look at the painting in the KMA collection, you'll notice how structural elements in this archway that appears to welcome us into the town, and there's a wire that comes out of here that just stops. And then if you look over here, some of the panels on the houses appear ajar and dislocated. And if you look at the tracks that lead into the town, they appear just to dissolve or completely cut off. And then there are other parts of the composition that look almost as if they're eroded by acid or blown away by some strange force. And then what I've referred to in Ulf Puder's work is that these are almost like, it's like the architecture of trauma, that he's looking back to traumatic things that happened in Eastern Europe, looking at atomic era photography, or looking at a devastated building. It's almost as if these are things that are informing his compositions and getting him to find subtle ways to craft paintings that incorporate psychological trauma within their very boundaries and borders. So I want to leave you with a few questions that came to mind that I thought might be relevant. What external or internal factors contribute to shifts in an artist's manner of painting? And do these shifts reflect corresponding changes in brain function? To what degree does art serve artists as an outlet or a buffer when they're affected by mental illness? And finally, this is one that I want to challenge all of you to consider. How does the brain, your brains, perceive electronic reproductions of art versus encountering them as physical objects? So your assignment tonight is take on that final question. I'd be curious to hear what you find. And thanks again for being here tonight.